Hello, and today we are discussing the Person, Environment, Occupation, or PEO model. I'm Brenda Howard, and this is Applied Occupational Theory. So when I first looked at our textbook and our new edition, I noticed that the authors had basically combined person, environment, occupation, and Canadian model of occupational performance and engagement. And I didn't really like that because they're really two very separate models with a different visual view, a different focus. The one thing that they do have in common, actually a couple of things, is that they were made for Canada. The CMOP-E is Canada's paradigm, basically their view of occupation and the domain of occupational therapy, and the PEO is more the application side of things. So they are companion models. However, they are very different in their focus and they can be used independently of each other. So we're going to talk about the PEO, and then at the end we'll talk a little bit about how these models are different from each other. And I would encourage you to look at sources other than the Cole and Tufano textbook in order to get an idea of the PEO model. The original articles by Law, 1996, and Strong et al., 1999, are very good articles to look at. So how did the PEO develop? It was developed as a companion model to CMOP, and Mary Law, who also did some work on the CMOP, worked extensively on this model with about 5 other people. Mary Law was influenced greatly by the PEOP model in the United States and actually worked very closely and did some publishing with Christensen and Baum about the concepts that are in the PEO model. The article from 1996 has a great deal of social science sources showing where these theoretical perspectives came from, and they actually took sort of a model that had person and environment and added the occupational piece to it. One of the things that I like about the PEO model is that it tends to have sort of a dynamic, moving model, and I think that helps show the transactional piece that the authors were trying to get to. They use this arrow to show the trajectory over the lifespan and at how different points in the lifespan, the same person can show a greater overlap or fit of the person, environment, and occupation, or a lesser overlap. And it depends on what's going on in the person's life, what's going on in their environment, or what are their occupational choices at the particular time. In this way, this model is a great one to think about how each of the aspects impact people. Maybe there's nothing that's changed about the person, but maybe they've experienced a natural disaster, or they are victims of war violence. So that changes their occupation, and it shows that occupational therapists have a role whenever any of these 3 things change. Here is another view of how the model is trying to show the dynamic nature of the transaction between person, environment, and occupation, and how that creates occupational performance. So with this dynamic nature, what they're saying is transactional goes beyond interactional, that one thing is always impacting everything else. If our environment changes, it changes our routines. If our occupations change, then we might need a different environment. So there's always different things going on between these 3 aspects of the person. It's always in flux. So transactional, it's more than just interactional, and there's a constant impact. So as these things interact, these 3 circles in our Venn diagram either overlap further and pull together, or they overlap less and pull apart. So we're looking at trying to maximize the fit or minimize the fit. And all people do this at all the time, trying to maximize their fit. But sometimes they need a little bit of help, and that's where occupational therapy comes in. So occupational performance is the outcome of that PEO transaction, and the fit is just another way of saying occupational performance in this model. So OT maximizes the PEO fit. So let's look at the concepts in a little more detail. And one of the things that I actually like about this model is there's not a lot of definitions. You get to define these things for yourself, or the client can define them for themselves. Person, notice there is nothing that says, great detail about all the different aspects of the person. It just says mind, body, spiritual. And this is dynamic and ever changing. A person's history doesn't change, their cultural background, what went on before does not change, but the individual's interpretation and practices can be modified. A great way of thinking about this is think about mental health and someone who may have experienced abuse in their past. They can redefine that abuse and make it be something that helps make them stronger, and they can start interpreting it differently. So that can increase that fit as well. So that's the person aspect. Moving on to the environment. Notice that the environment is only related to the context within which occupation takes place. So all the other environments we're not necessarily concerned with in this particular model. We're looking at a certain person, or in some cases you could use your client. Your client could be a group or an organization, but we're looking at the context in which the occupation takes place for this client rather than all the occupation and all the context everywhere. So this environment is influenced by a person and influences a person. So if you think about, let's say you move to a new apartment, you're going to influence your environment by putting your own touches on it. But how you go about your routines, just the layout of that apartment is going to influence you as well. That's just a very simple example of how our environments influence us and we influence our environments. And some of the listing of the types of environments are cultural, social, economic, institutional, physical, social, person, household, neighborhood, community. So they're looking at those levels of context as well. We'll have how the small, just the person's environment, but all the way out to the community as well. Occupation is whatever meets the person's intrinsic needs for self-maintenance, expression, and fulfillment in the context of roles and environments. So there's a certain sense in which occupations meet a person's need in this model. Another idea about occupation is that there are nested concepts. So activity in this particular model is the basic unit of a task. It's the smallest unit that we can have of a person's occupation. So let's take the example of writing, a person's ability to use a pencil or pen and write on a piece of paper. Now we have a task. So let's say we have a set of purposeful activities. We're writing a report. We still need to be able to use the pencil on the paper or the pen on the paper, but we need to have the content as well. So there's a cognitive component of writing that report. Or perhaps now we've moved what we used to do on pen and paper and we're using a computer. So now we have the technology aspect as well. Now, an occupation is going to be a group of self-directed functional tasks and activities in which a person engages over the lifespan. So I am sure that you have been writing reports since you were in elementary school, and I'm sure your ability and how you go about writing a report has changed over time. So now maybe as a student you're writing research papers, but as you go into the therapist role, you're going to be writing client reports as well. And the skills are slightly different. However, they still use a physical component, possibly a technological component, and definitely a cognitive component as well. So that's showing how an occupation changes over time and how the concepts are nested. And an occupational therapist can use their ability to analyze occupations to break down occupations into those component parts. So occupations then are also clusters of activities and tasks, and they can be for self-maintenance, expression, fulfillment. So that's really about all the definition of occupation in terms of we don't have categories of occupations. And then occupations have temporal aspects, which I think is a cool way of thinking about occupations in this model. They occur over time, they change over time, they have patterns, rhythm, and routine, and they can change according to other things like time of day, age of the participant. So there are multiple temporal aspects to occupations. Another assumption of PEO is that occupational performance, or that fit in the center, is complex and dynamic and changes over time. So this is a continual interaction in time and space between the person, environment, and occupation, which increases or diminishes their congruence, that overlap in the middle. And we can assume that the better the fit, the better these things are working together, the better the occupational performance that the person is going to have. So here's just a summary of PEO. PEO function means a maximized fit. Dysfunction is a poor fit. Motivation in this model is intrinsic, that the person wants to participate in occupation. Change is constant and transactional in this model. So change is occurring whether it's toward the better for the person, the better fit, or toward a worser fit. It's happening all the time. With evaluation, we're assessing the person for fit, and there are a number of things that we can use for that, including the COPM, which of course then we would be borrowing from the CMOP, but we're also going to have to assess the person, assess the environment, assess the occupation. And the goal for intervention is always to maximize the fit, although this particular model tells us why and how, but it doesn't exactly tell us what to do, and for that we'll need our frames of reference. So here's a schematic that talks about how we assess the person. So we're definitely going to want to talk to them and get their occupational history. From there, we will look at assessing the environment, assessing the person, and assessing the occupation. Then we bring those together in this transactional framework to consider the person, the environment, and the occupation, and how can we maximize that fit. So one of the things that PEO does for intervention is considers the area of overlap. So how can we bring the person and the environment together? Do we need some environmental modifications? Do we need some task modifications? The environment and the occupation. So just in general, is this the correct environment for this occupation, or do we need to find a different environment? And then the person and occupation is all about, is the person fitting into the particular occupation? And do we need some adaptive equipment? Do we need to do some strengthening with the person? Do we need to do some adapting of the occupation? So just thinking of the overlap helps us think in ways that makes it easy for us to consider, what does this person need? How can we help this person get that better fit? Here's a little comparison of the PEO and the CMOP-E. And I'm not going to read through all of them, but I just want you to notice that they have a different function and dysfunction, a little bit different focus. How change occurs is a little bit different. In CMOP-E, change is driven by the human spirit, whereas change in PEO is just occurring constantly in one direction or another, and it's just a matter of which way we're guiding it. Intervention in CMOP considers those 6 principles of client-centered practice, whereas in PEO, we're just looking at maximizing the fit and looking at those areas of overlap and how can we make it better. So how do you do a rationale? How do you decide which one you're going to use? Well, I think PEO is great to use when you want to focus on the transaction, how these things are working together. Another great time to use it is when you're collaborating with the client. I can draw 3 circles on a piece of paper and tell the client, hey, I'm trying to make these 3 things come together. I understand how to do that. What I need from you is what's inside the circles. What's most important to you as a person? What are the environments like that you work in? And what are your most desired occupations? And then we can work at making those overlaps happen. I might want to use the CMOP-E when I want to put the client in the center and when I want to consider what's the motivational factor. I find the CMOP-E to be really helpful if the person is struggling with motivation. So I can think about what's driving this person, or what's the issue that's making them not have a drive? What gives them meaning in life? And are they simply depressed because they're not able to access that meaning right now? So that's really useful for me. I also find that when I want to use the COPM for goal setting, I'm basically using the concepts of the CMOP-E. So anytime you're using the COPM, you're using the CMOP-E. Here are my references. Thanks for sharing in this conversation about PEO. I hope it's given you some things to think about, and I'll see you later. Thank you.